Hey ghouls and gals, welcome back to my channel. My name is Taylor and today's vlog is yet another installation in my series where I am reading my way through 101 horror books to read before you're murdered by Sadie Hartmann, aka Mother Horror. Today's vlog is going to be focused all about cults. Now, the cults section of this book actually has 7 book recommendations, which is a lot, so this is going to be a little bit of a longer vlog. Grab a snack, grab a drink. Luckily, I have already read 2 of the books, so there are going to be 5 books in this vlog, but I'm really excited to read them all because just based on the 2 books that I've read out of this section already, cult horror is something that I apparently really like and is really effective for me. Sadie Hartmann says in the introduction to this section that she loves when authors rip down the veil to reveal what goes on behind closed doors. All the dark liturgy, ritualistic sacrifices, and underground secret meetings are fascinating. We all have a morbid curiosity about things that seem taboo or scandalous. We cannot look away. We must satisfy all the speculation and the burning questions. So the first book that I've already read in this section is The Twisted Ones by T. Kingfisher. I think this is one of T. Kingfisher's most slept on books. It came out in 2019. I distinctly remember reading this one. I was in a crowded place when I was reading some parts of this, middle of the day, but I got so creeped out. This is culty horror that also takes place in an isolated woodsy setting. Unrelated, but I apologize about the lighting. The lighting was great, and then I sat down to film and it's just doing all sorts of strangeness. So focus on the books, not the lighting situation, but this one is about our main character. Her father can no longer take care of his estate and she goes to this house in the middle of the woods. There's no cell phone service, there's no Wi-Fi connection, and she starts finding a series of journals and writings by her family members that make her suspect that something sinister is in the woods. It's weird, it's creepy, it's the worst book to bring to an isolated setting because this book is really gonna get under your skin. Very creepy, absolutely loved it. T. Kingfisher is an author that always brings something strange and wild to the table, and this book is no exception, so I really loved this one. The other book in this section that I have read and loved is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is actually one of my favorite Gothic horror books of all time. I love Silvia Moreno-Garcia. She is an auto-read author for me. This one is absolutely, like, if you like Gothic books, this is how a modern book pays tribute to the classics in a perfect way and adds a little bit more to the genre. We're following our main character Noemi, and she gets a very disturbing letter from her cousin. Her cousin says that she is in danger and she has just gotten married and she lives in the middle of nowhere. So Noemi packs up her things, travels to go visit her cousin and make sure that everything is okay. She stays at this house and this house is so creepy. This is a great haunted house horror, but the things that go on in it, not only is the house creepy, but the people who inhabit the house are creepy as well. And this one has such an explosive ending and I love it. Talking about this book makes me want to reread it because this is just, it's one of my favorite haunted house books of all time, honestly, and I just cannot say enough good things about this one. I'm not going to be rereading it for this vlog because we have enough books on our TBR already, but I might be convinced now to reread this during spooky season because I love it. I really love it. I know this got a lot of buzz when it came out in 2020, but if you haven't picked it up already, I would highly recommend. It was worth all of the hype then, it's worth all the hype now. I really loved it. So because there are so many books that we are reading in this vlog, I'm not going to introduce them in depth as I usually do at the beginning of these vlogs, just quickly run through them and then get on with the vlog because like I mentioned before, this is going to be a longer one, but for this vlog, we are going to be reading Beneath by Kristi DeMeester. This, I believe, takes place in Appalachia. We follow a newspaper reporter and she gets reports of a snake cult and she goes to investigate, and apparently her assignment hits a little too close to home. The next book we are reading for this vlog is Revelator by Daryl Gregory, and this, Mother Horror says, it's not only one of her favorite cult books, but it's one of her favorite books of all time, so very intrigued about this one. This, I believe, is a family saga. We're following multiple, like, timelines, and again, culty. There's some strange religious things happening in rural Tennessee. The next book on the TBR is Devil's Cradle Creek by Todd Kiesling, and this one says it's a little bit Stephen King, a little bit Lovecraft. This is a culty book that has a very cosmic spin on things, so that's definitely very intriguing. Takes place in Kentucky. It's a very small, isolated setting, cult horror with a cosmic twist. The next book on this TBR is The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. I was a little surprised to see this on the list because I've only ever seen this marketed as fantasy, but Mother Horror does say, kind of like Neil Gaiman's work, it kind of defies genre. We have fantasy elements, of course, but we also have like very horrific elements, so this is going to be kind of like a horror fantasy, so I'm excited to read kind of a little bit of a different genre for this vlog. But this is following the titular library at Mount Char. There are people that are all grouped together for a certain purpose. They have to figure out what it is, and they may have had like a very strange upbringing. I'm very intrigued by the comparison to Neil Gaiman and the fact that this has been on my TBR forever, and I just never would have expected it, number one, to kind of feature a cult, and then number two, to see this in this book. I'm really excited to finally take this off my TBR and read it. And then last but not least, we have Little Eve by Catriona Ward, and other than the fact that this is in the cult section, I don't know a single thing about it. I don't want to know a single thing about it, because the thing about Catriona Ward is that her books, you want to go into them not really knowing what's going on, because the ride that you're taken on is wild. I've read 3 books by this author before. I've loved 2. I haven't liked the other, but even the one that I didn't like, I can't say that it didn't make me feel things, and that the twists and the ending wasn't shocking, and the way that this author plays with timelines and unreliable narrators and points of view are always so interesting. So I think that the potential for this one to be a really great cult book, because Catriona Ward already has proven that she writes incredible, very nuanced, creepy horror with unreliable protagonists. I think that that could be really cool for a cult setting. This one also, I believe, takes place in Scotland. Not too sure, but the cover is gorgeous, and I think this one's gonna be like a darker, moody, more atmospheric cult book. So we are actually going to be kicking this vlog off with Revelator by Daryl Gregory. This is the book that's due the soonest at the library, so that is what we're gonna kick off this vlog with. Mother Horror says, aside from being an iconic horror book, Revelator is one of the best books I've ever read, period. An intricately crafted, richly detailed story about a young woman named Stella Birch Wallace, who is running a successful bootlegging outfit in 1948 when she gets word of her grandmother's passing. She must return to the family farm where she grew up to check on a young girl named Sunny before the rest of her family gets there. A dual timeline from 1933 follows Stella's upbringing at the farm. Her father leaves Stella in his mother's care, a stoic woman named Maudie Birch, while he goes to look for work. Stella helps Maudie tend to the farm as well as fulfill religious duties for her family. They worship the god in the mountain, intimately and secretively known as Ghost Daddy. As the intensifying tale unfolds between the 2 timelines, the saga of this family's secret insular faith and worship of this deity in the mountain builds to a mind-blowing crescendo. So that is very high praise. Not only Mother Horror, but Stephen Graham Jones and Paul Tremblay have blurbed this on the back of this book. So let's dive in. I'm gonna get 50% of the way through this one, and then I will let y'all know my thoughts. So I am now 50% of the way through Revelator, and I'm really enjoying this so far. A little bit of a backstory with me and Great Depression era fiction. I know that sounds like a very strange tangent, but bear with me. When I was a kid, I had Kit Kittredge, the American Girl doll. Her story was that she was growing up during the Great Depression, and the American Girl dolls, if you're not familiar, they come with fictionalized stories about the doll, but then they also have like non-fiction segments at the back of the books for related nonfiction books. So for me, as someone who grew up loving history and even like got a history degree, the Great Depression was an era of history that I really was drawn to at a young age. I was so fascinated in both fiction stories about the Great Depression and then also nonfiction. So between those Kit Kittredge books and then the Dear America series and then just various other fiction titles for children that I read during my youth, had to deal with the Great Depression. It was a time period of historical fiction that I really enjoyed. I really was struck by the emotional themes in that period of history. So it has been a while. I definitely don't read as much historical fiction as I do as an adult than when I was a child. As an adult, if I'm picking up historical fiction, it's usually historical fiction fantasy or historical horror, and this is one of those. It is a family saga in a way of a family during the Great Depression. So that's why I bring up all that Kit Kittredge talk, because it has been a while since I've become immersed in this type of setting, and it just feels so nostalgic for me, if that makes sense. I'm really connecting with this main character and just really appreciating the rural landscape and the community and the ways in which these characters are struggling to get by and finding small joys amidst big disappointments and huge catastrophes in the events of the time. But this book, we are following our main character Stella. We have two timelines here, and one of them is when Stella is a girl. Her father drops her off at a grandmother's house that she has never met. Her grandmother lives in the backwoods of the Tennessee Smoky Mountains, and when she's there, she's being raised by her grandmother, and she learns that her family is not Christian, but they have their own essentially cult where they pray to a god that only interacts with this family, and that god is referred to as Ghost Daddy. Stella is a child, and because she is a young woman, not even young woman, but young girl, she is given the task of a Revelator, where she meets with the god and the god speaks through her to give the god's prophecy and messaging to her family. Now, we are in the other timeline as well, as Stella is now an adult. She's a bootlegger, she sells moonshine, and her grandmother has died. So she returns back to the Tennessee Smoky Mountains and has to have a reckoning with her family, with this cult that she has escaped from, and just certain traumas that have happened in her childhood. When she arrives home for her grandmother's funeral, she discovers that certain members of her family have taken the teachings and the cult and have expanded it to not just a family affair, but something that has more traction and are telling more outside people about this cult. So I'm really enjoying this one. I like the dual timelines. I feel like we really get a sense for Stella as a character because we're following her as a child and as an adult. This is just so haunting, so atmospheric, Southern Gothic. This also has a lot to say about religion in general, because as a child, Stella is trying to find her way in this community and trying to figure out exactly how much power she has in this cult, because it may not be as much as she thinks that she has. This is definitely one of the best Southern Gothic books I've ever read. I cannot wait to finish this one. It's so haunting, it's so atmospheric. When I pick it up, I really feel transported to 1933 Tennessee. So I'm going to go wrap up Stella's story, and then I will come back on and give my final thoughts. Okay, so I finished Revelator by Daryl Gregory, and I really enjoyed this one overall. I would definitely say if you like Southern Gothic, if you like slower creeping horror where the horror is a little bit supernatural, a little bit cosmic paranormal, but also really grounded and rooted in family dynamics, and where even though there are monsters, you know, people can be just as monstrous, I think that you would really like this one. This one really hooked me from the first sentence. sentence. The first sentence of this one is Stella Wallace met her family's god when she was 9 years old. And from that point on, I was absolutely invested in Stella's story and her family story and family saga that unfolds here. Now, this one is definitely like slower paced. It's a character study. The character of Ghost Daddy is central to the story, but we don't actually see him on page all that much, which I think is a really fascinating and interesting choice. I kind of like it because he's more of like this presence, this mysterious presence that's looming over this family saga, which is taking front and center stage. And I really think that the way that Ghost Daddy is utilized and the times that we see him versus the times that we don't, but he's just utilized as a threat, really enforces the commentary that this book is giving on just the ways in which the patriarchy corrupts religion or cults, and the way that patriarchal religious structures use fear to control people in their respective religions or cults. So I thought that was really, really well done. Don't go into this expecting like Ghost Daddy on every single page and like this huge cryptid kind of horror. I thought that was a really fascinating choice. I loved what this had to say about the corruption of religion for personal gain, and I really appreciated the family saga and exploring the different ways in which family ties can be corrupted and really twisted in nefarious ways. There's a big found family element in here. Stella is essentially orphaned at the beginning of this book, and then the different people that she meets, whether they're related to her or not, like they really make this very dysfunctional family, for better or for worse, and that continues throughout her adulthood. I loved the setting of this one, and I'm definitely going to be checking out more from Daryl Gregory in the future because this is a really good Southern Gothic. The biggest takeaway for this one is it's not horror in the sense where it's like in your face jump scare horror, but in the sense that you're following Stella, and a lot of times you as the reader understand what's happening before Stella does, particularly when she's a child. But I think that's part of the horror that adds to the unease and unsettling features of this book, because you know what's going to happen and you can't do anything. You just have to sit there and watch and read as Stella slowly uncovers the horrors that have to deal with her family legacy and the cult and Ghost Daddy. So yeah, this is a really good start to the vlog. I enjoyed this one. So first book down, we're now moving on to the second book in this vlog, and that is going to be Little Eve by Catriona Ward. Mother Horror says, I wanted to live in the pages of this book and never ever leave. My reading experience was so vivid and delicious, I can recall the way it made me feel just by thinking of the book. The imagery, the mood, they flooded my mind with scenes of a turbulent sea, an isolated, crumbling castle called Altanahara, and the soggy, bleak landscape of Scotland. This is a story told in reverse, beginning with the ritualistic murder of a strange, isolated family. Their bodies are discovered by someone who lives in the neighboring town. He finds one survivor, a woman named Dinah. Dinah eventually tells her tale in court, implicating one person, Little Eve. Little Eve is peak Gothic vibes. Readers who love a complicated murder mystery, strange religious cults, and strong female protagonists will likely fall in love with Little Eve. So I am definitely excited to read this one. I've had a lot of success with this author's books in the past, so let's dive into Little Eve. I'm going to read to the 50% mark, and then I'll let y'all know my thoughts. Okay, so I am now 50% of the way through Little Eve, and this one we're following two different timelines. One of the timelines is in 1921, and we are following Dinah. She is the sole survivor of a massacre that happened to her family. And then in 1917, we are following Eve, who is another member of Dinah's family, and I use the term family very loosely. They both are a part of a family system that is actually a cult when you start diving into what exactly this family is about and the family structure and the things that they believe in. They live on an isolated isle in Scotland, and they are ruled by their uncle. This is a religious cult that believes that the end times are coming, and the uncle really facilitates a lot of rituals and teaches these girls and the other children and women on this island very strange rituals and beliefs. Dinah and Eve are both like bought into the cult in like a different way. Eve is a lot more on board with the cult, or so it seems from her point of view. She believes that she has what it takes to be the next leader of this cult and is really trying to obtain like a higher status in the cult, is really buying into everything that their uncle is telling her. And then we are following Dinah, who from her point of view was never like, didn't really buy into the isolation and everything that the cult was teaching them. But as we get further into this book, we start to see discrepancies between Dinah's story and Eve's story, and because of the way that Catriona Ward likes to play with unreliable narrators, or just narrators that withhold things from you and different points of view and different time periods, I am quite interested to see what's going on there, because at the outset you would think that Dinah and Eve would be reliable storytellers, but based on their very traumatic upbringing, you can see how maybe they're not even lying to you, but maybe they're lying to themselves in order to make certain aspects of their childhood more palatable. I will say for this one, there is a lot of body horror when it comes to the things that their uncle makes them do. There is a lot of bloodletting and starvation and rituals, and the children do get punished for things that go against the cult, or if they are not properly honoring their uncle in the best way. So keep that in mind. This could be really triggering if you are very sensitive to violence against children. And I think what makes this even more sinister at times is the things the children go through are horrific and they are abuse, but because they're so normalized, a lot of the times the children don't even like describe it as abuse, or they're not even scared of the things that are happening to them because it's just such a part of their daily life. So keep in mind this one is a little bit hard because of that, but I am very invested in this story. Absolutely a Gothic tale. This won the Shirley Jackson Award in the year it came out, and I can definitely see why. Very atmospheric, very Gothic. The two points of views are very strong and differentialized, and it's so interesting because when Dinah is telling the story, you get a sense for who Dinah is as a character and who Eve is as a character. But then we switch to Eve's point of view and you get a whole different perspective on who Eve is as a character and who Dinah is. And a lot of the times they feel like four different characters. So it's going to be really interesting in the latter 50% of this novel as we peel back maybe some of the mysteries, see if potentially like maybe someone's lying or editing some of the truth or portraying themselves or someone else in maybe not a flattering light, or maybe they both genuinely believe that they are telling the full truth and nothing but the truth. So this is very engaging. Catriona Ward is definitely an author where I have been like entertained and really drawn in by every single book that I've read from her. Even the one that I did not end up loving, I was glued to the pages from beginning to end. So this one is quite a similar reading experience. Really enjoying the Gothic vibes. I'm gonna go finish this up and then I will check back in, let y'all know how the last 50% went for me. Okay, so I finished Little Eve by Catriona Ward and I really enjoyed this one. I thought this was such an excellently done Gothic story. What I really loved about this one is that there are two points of view that you're following throughout the story, and you know, the 2 points of view don't necessarily align. The stories that they're telling, they can tell the same event. There are details that are different. There are character intentions that are different. So you're trying to figure out like what actually happened, and there are so many Easter eggs hidden throughout this book that by the time that you reach the end, you realize that you had the clues, even though you didn't realize it at the time, to figure out some of these things. And even the smallest details make a lot of sense later, even if you don't understand why you're getting them at the beginning of the story. So this one, I feel like if you reread it, you would pick that up a lot faster and be able to see where all of these clues were hidden perfectly. I think that's something Catriona Ward does really well, and I really enjoyed this one. I don't think this this is my favorite of hers. I still think Looking Glass Sound is my favorite Catriona Ward that I've ever read. I think this one probably, I think it's a little bit stronger than Sundial, and I like The House at the End of the Street, or The House on Needless Street. That one is my least favorite. I know that's an unpopular opinion. I know that tends to be the one that people like the most, but that's my least favorite. So I think this is probably my second favorite after Looking Glass Sound. So I really enjoyed it. It's really cemented into my mind that Catriona Ward is an auto read author for me. So definitely had a lot of fun with that one. This is like that perfect Gothic atmospheric read. This vlog is going really well for me so far. Let's hope that the next book goes just as well, and that is going to be Beneath by Kristi DeMeester. Cora Mayborn, a journalist, is told she is going to rural Appalachia on assignment to investigate a story about a snake handling cult. Fundamentalist religious abuse is something she had to wrestle with in her past, so this particular assignment weighs heavily on her. She meets a young preacher man named Michael, and they become fast friends. Cora maintains her professional journalistic approach at first, but then that veneer begins to dissolve as she becomes sucked into the affairs of the strange townsfolk. The storyline blends a variety of horror subgenres. There's psychological horror, the depravity of religion gone off the rails, monsters, creatures, snakes, and lastly, good old-fashioned body horror. So I am definitely sensing some common themes with these picks, because this is about like a snake cult, as I just said, and Little Eve's cult that had to deal with snakes as well. This is also set in Appalachia, and Revelator by Daryl Gregory was also set in that area of the United States. So always interesting to see those repeat themes. So I'm going to go get to reading this one. I'll check back in at the 50% mark, let y'all know how I'm feeling. So 50% of the way through Beneath, I am really loving this one. From the very first chapter, I read some sentences, some turns of phrase that made me think this could be a 5-star. Fingers crossed, not trying to jinx anything, but this one's really working for me so far, and I will say, on paper, just based on the synopsis, this one feels like the most traditionally culty to me, and I'll go into what I mean when I say that, because I think when you think of a cult story or a cult horror, you think of maybe a whole isolated community that's in on this cult. You think of maybe an outsider coming in and investigating and slowly being drawn in to the cult and various individuals inside, and that's exactly what's happening here, and I'm loving that setup because it does feel like a very traditional, a very familiar setup, but one that is really being experimented with a little bit, and the way that this is going is anything but traditional. So I'm really enjoying this. We're following Cora. She is a reporter, and she has a lot of religious trauma. This is chapter 1, so it's not a spoiler. She was sexually assaulted by a holy man, a preacher, a minister. I don't know the exact terminology that she used or the exact sect that this man was from, but she has religious trauma based on sexual abuse. So she's not religious by any means. She thought she's put that all behind her, but she gets this assignment to go and investigate this very strange town. This town is nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, and while it is Christianity, they have a lot of practices and beliefs involving snakes and speaking in tongues and just things that are a little bit different than most Christians believe in. So she gets this assignment. She's really worried about it because of this trauma, but you know, she figures let's face it head on. She's a good reporter. This is a great assignment. Let's go and investigate. So we're following her. We're also following several people in this small town. We're following a young woman who is starting to become initiated and become an adult member in the church. We're following her mother. They have a very interesting family history. We're also following the preacher who has some secrets of his own and is really wrestling with his faith, and that is something that I actually do love. I think I mentioned this in the demonic possession episode of this series, that I do do like religious horror, and I do like when we follow a religious character who especially is a figurehead of a church or something like that, like The Exorcist. We're following a person who maybe has some doubts about his religion and is struggling with that. So I like all of those elements. I would say, you know, I normally hate doing this, but just based on vibes and plot structure and the themes that are being examined in terms of a cult setting, I would say this is The Exorcist meets Midsummer. Now, I know those are very, very weighty comp titles to compare this to, but I love them both, and I'm really getting those vibes, especially an outsider going in and looking at this cult and kind of slowly starting to realize that bad things are happening and that there are a lot of secrets within the town and within the cult. And then we also have a main character that is really struggling with religion and some other demons as well. So this one's really working for me. I am flying through it. I have a really good feeling about this one. I've read one other thing by Kristi DeMeester, Such a Pretty Smile, and I did really enjoy it. It's one where I remember I did stay up really late reading it because I was really invested, especially in like the climax and the ending of that story. So I cannot imagine, like, the first 50% has been so compelling to me. I cannot imagine how the next 50% is going to go, but I am absolutely loving this one. I'm gonna go finish it up, and then I will check back in here and let y'all know my final thoughts. Okay, so I finished Beneath, and unfortunately this is not the 5-star that I was anticipating this book to be, but I did still really enjoy it overall. Now this one, the synopsis that I gave, it is that in the beginning, and then it quickly transforms into something else. I said at the beginning when I was first talking about this, when I was reading it up to the 50% mark, I was talking about how this one felt the most stereotypical cult-like. We have an outsider going to a small isolated community and kind of seeing all of the secrets that a small town is hiding and an unconventional religion system. So we start out like that. It starts transforming into something else. It was going really well. I really liked that tonal change until I didn't. There's a lot about the end I can't talk about because spoilers, but the end, I'll just say the last 50% of this book went in a slightly more cosmic way than I was expecting. First 50% of this book was really great Southern Gothic horror, and then it really kind of transformed into something more Gothic, and just the tone shift worked almost all of the way for me, but then it kind of went off the rails in a wild way that I was here for most of the ride, but just didn't really stick the landing. But overall, this was really good. It was effective horror. There were some really creepy moments. I did stay up really late last night reading this, and it was very creepy to read this alone at night. The monster design, for lack of a better word, because I don't want to get into spoilers, but there's a lot of creature design that is very creepy, very gross. If you have any sort of aversion to snakes or worms, I would maybe skip this one, but there are some very crazy scenes. There are some very scary scenes, but just the overall and like the commentary and like how things wrapped up just didn't really work for me. But this was definitely a very interesting, very visceral ride. I do want to make a quick note because as I was introducing this book, the synopsis talks about how Cora and the preacher become fast friends. They do not. They don't. I want to get that out of the way. This is not like a fast friend scenario. It's more of two people who in any other circumstance would not spend an hour with each other but have to spend time with each other because all of a sudden they're working to defeat the same evil. They're working like they have the same common goal. So I think that's a wildly different dynamic than maybe what you're set up to believe, and just this this one could get really heavy. It's very sexually explicit with Cora's past and just the things that happen in this cult and happen throughout the story. This one is definitely the most sexually explicit that I've read so far, which can be super triggering, especially compared with religious themes and religious trauma themes. So tread lightly going into that one if that is any trigger for you. I am really glad that I read Kristi DeMeester's second, her sophomore novel before this one, because I definitely think the things that I didn't love about this one, the second book, I think it was Such a Pretty Smile, that I think that is the title of that book, but the things that I didn't love about like the narrative structure and all of that, I enjoyed the second book better. So I'm glad I read this. This author is continuously improving upon her craft, which is really great. So this one, unless you've got like a very strong stomach and you can handle a lot of dark, sexually graphic content, because it is in there, it gets very dark, then maybe steer clear of this one. But this was very unsettling, and overall I'm having a really great time with this vlog. So I definitely don't want to jinx this, but 3 books into this vlog, and I think this cult vlog is the most successful vlog out of this vlog series in terms of star ratings so far. So I'm really excited to continue on this vlog, hopefully continue this great book momentum with Devil's Creek by Todd Kiesling. Mother Horror says that Devil's Creek is the perfect example of quality cult horror. Stafford, Kentucky is a fictional small town haunted by the legend of Jacob Master's death cult, the Lord's Church of Holy Voices, in which the townspeople worshipped a nameless deity in a church at Devil's Creek. The history of this congregation ends in tragedy. A fire kills everyone except the Stafford 6. 30 years later, the 6 have grown up and moved on. One of the 6 must return to his small hometown to take care of his grandmother's estate and is revisited by the history of Devil's Creek. Told in 5 parts, Kiesling spends quality time peeling back the layers of this seemingly quaint town to reveal the dark and insidious roots below. This is apparently horror inspired by King and Lovecraft, so I'm really intrigued to see what that's all about. I have the audiobook for this one checked out from Hoopla, so really excited to dive into this one. I'll get to reading and I'll check back in at the 50% mark. Okay friends, so I am now 50% of the way through Devil's Creek, and I might have jinxed myself. Because I don't know if I'm loving this one as much as I have been loving the other books in this vlog. I think a huge part of that does unfortunately have to deal with the narrator, because the only way that I could read this book right now is the audiobook copy. My library did not have a physical copy or an ebook copy. The only way I could read it was through audio on Hoopla, so it's unfortunately not the best audiobook for me. I do not care for the audiobook narrator. He has like no inflection in his voice. He's very deadpan. I think audiobooks are at their best when the audiobook narrator is performing, is acting, is telling you a story instead of just reading something very monotone, which is unfortunately like my experience with this audiobook, because it's just, there's no character voices. He doesn't differentiate between the characters. He's just reading it. It's a very flat narration. He's not like acting out the emotions or anything that the characters are doing. He's just reading from a script. So I don't love it, and I'm worrying that that may be impacting like all of my feelings about this book, because it's very hard to get into, especially like the first 5 minutes when I dive into this one and I'm reading it, and it's hard to dive in when I'm doing other things. This is definitely one where I have to be doing other things so I can like pretend that the narration is a little bit better as opposed to just sitting down and listening to the audiobook. But it's not going great. Don't love the audiobook. I really wish I could pick this up physically, but I am 50% of the way through, and like this story should be interesting. It's interesting on paper. Our main character is one of a handful of children who are the only survivors of a cult. These children obviously had a lot of trauma from these events that happened in this cult. They have a lot of trauma and trigger warnings because they do go into depth about what happened to them at the hands of this cult and at their cult leader. But the children manage to escape this cult. This is the first chapter of the book. The children's grandparents actually get together and perform sort of like a rescue mission. So they save these kids, the Stafford Six, and then end up raising them apart from this cult. They try to move on, have normal lives. That's obviously very hard if you've had quite an unconventional upbringing full of very, very horrific trauma. But our main character, he is an artist and he lives in the big city far away from this small town life. However, when his grandmother, his caretaker, dies, he has to come home, settle her estate, and realizes that things with the cult may not be as over as everyone thought that they were decades ago. It's a great premise. It's one that usually works for me. I like small town horror. I like cyclical horror. I like a group of friends who are friends as children and then they reunite as adults. It is one of my favorite books, it by Stephen King, I mean. So I really, really like these tropes. There's a lot happening in this book that I should love. However, 50% of the way through, this is like very slow moving. We have not gotten a lot of the cultishness. We've been introduced to our main characters and we start seeing things start happening in this small town. But for 50%, and this is a huge book, I'm listening to the audiobook, but I believe the print version of this book is between 400 and 500 pages. So it's a significant amount of pages, and where we are, I just don't feel like we have enough character development to justify this book being that long. Like I mentioned again, I love it. It's over 1,000 pages, and I love that one because of all of the character development. The Losers Club feels so real. They feel like real people. So I love a slow moving book when it's very character driven. However, for this one, it's moving really slow. We've been introduced to characters, but I'm not really getting like a sense for who they are as characters rather than just like very stock stereotype characters. So I'm interested in what's going on. I just don't know. I don't know how this one is like really working for me, unfortunately, because again, on paper, this one sounds like it would be a perfect 5-star read for me. Could be the narration, but also I'm wondering if it's genuinely like a 5-star story for me. It probably shouldn't matter if the narration isn't the best, right? So yeah, we'll have to see. 50% of the way in. I'm hoping the next half we get more character development so I can start to care more about these characters, and then we dive more into the actual cultishness and the story starts to pick up a little bit. So fingers crossed the second half goes a little bit better for me, but I will check back in when I finish this one and let y'all know how this ended up being for me. So I finished Devil's Creek last night and I really ended up not liking this book at all. I was optimistic maybe about the second 50% going better than the first half, but I just thought it really quickly went downhill for me, unfortunately. I just think for such a large book and such a slow moving book, you need to have character development. You need to have characters, whether they're good or bad. Like, I don't need to follow perfect characters. They can be very flawed, they can make bad decisions, but no matter what the characters are doing, whether they be unlikable or likable protagonists, I do need them to feel like real people. I need some character development, and for such a huge story, we do not get that at all. So if this book would have been like in the 200-300 page ranges, I think a lot of my issues with it would have been solved, just because it is so large for there not to be really any memorable main characters or characters that you really feel like you ever felt like not just what they were about and what their character was like, but how they interacted with other characters. It makes it really hard to care. At the beginning of this book, talking about the synopsis, we talk about the Stafford Six and how that is like a very big important part. These children were all horribly mistreated by this cult and they developed a camaraderie, and for all intents and purposes, without without spoiling too much, they do call each other brothers and sisters because of the very real trauma that they experienced. At no point did I get that they were like siblings. These characters that are supposed to be trauma bonded, that are supposed to gone through hell and back together and are supposed to have a camaraderie, they do not interact with each other any differently than any other two characters in this book. So that was very frustrating. This one, there's just too many points of view also. I believe I love a lot of books that do follow an entire town, but even when we do so, we have maybe 2 or 3 main points of view, and sometimes we'll get a one-off, seeing a different character. That's cool. I like that, but we had like maybe 10 points of views in here that we followed on a pretty consistent, regular basis, and if we would have narrowed that down, maybe had 2 or 3 main characters we were following, and then we maybe got one-shots of other characters, but not necessarily follow them for a large portion of time, I think that could have really helped with character building as well as I think, you know, there's probably a good 100 pages in here that is very explicitly describing sex. The sexual content in this was really hard to read, and there was so much of it. I could almost see having like maybe one scene or something like that, because again, you are following people who have been traumatized by a cult. I understand that, you know, maybe is a big trauma trigger, that is like a big theme throughout this book, but there were so many really descriptive scenes. Those scenes had more description than pretty much anything else in this book, which I really hated. I think there's a way, especially to write a book about characters that have gone through trauma and are experiencing trauma, that don't have explicit on-page, multiple page scenes having to deal with sexual assault, because it's not even like consensual sex scenes in here. It's really graphic. It's really graphic and brutal in just terms of sexual content, and that was really hard to read. I think that the premise of having characters that have gone through some horrific CSA in their pasts, and the different ways in which, you know, they're adults and they have to deal with that past and that trauma and their coping mechanisms and the way that they move past it and grow, I think that could make for a really interesting and a really dark story. However, this is not how that goes about. It feels like the content that was included, especially in terms of CSA, which look it up, I guess, if you don't know what that acronym is, because I don't think I can actually say it on my channel because it is very graphic and gruesome, but it felt like all of that content was just added in for nothing but shock value, and that's just, it was really hard to read, as well as just the ending was all over the place and didn't feel satisfying. So I really hated this, if I'm gonna be quite honest. It was not a fun reading experience. I probably would have DNF'd this one at like the 20 to 30% mark if I hadn't been reading it for a video, but yeah, unfortunately did not love this one. Definitely my least favorite book that I have read in this vlog so far. So with that disappointment out of the way, we are moving on to the final book in this vlog, and that is going to be The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. Mother Horror says this book defies genre labeling. It's an odd book. Equal parts fascination and wonder and confusion. Is it a fantasy book? Science fiction? Who cares? Today it's horror, and all you need to know is that you need to read it before you're murdered. There are so many moving parts and important aspects of this story. We are following Adam Black, or Father as his children call him. Father kidnapped people and brought them back to his library to train them to become gods. He forced these gods in training to adapt to his ancient customs, punishing them with instruments of torture when they failed to live up to his expectations. Now he's missing and possibly dead, and the gods must solve the mystery of his disappearance, suffer through their intense sibling rivalries, and to determine what will happen to the library and Father's legacy. So The Library at Mount Char is the last book that I'm reading in this vlog. Let's hope that we can turn it around, get a better reading experience out of this one. This is another chunkier book, but because it is like a horror fantasy, I'm hoping that this one goes a lot better for me than the last one. So I am staying optimistic. I'm going to go read the first 50% of this one, and I will check back in and let y'all know my thoughts. Okay, so I am now 50% through the way of the library at Mount Char, and I think I'm kind of obsessed with this book. I will say this is the most confused that I've ever been in a book. It does take a while to kind of understand what is happening, and still at 50%, there's so many mysteries. I'm still not sure quite what is happening, but I'm really, really invested. And I know usually when someone says, I feel very lost, I don't know what's going on, that's usually a bad thing. However, I would compare it almost to Piranesi. Like when you first dive into Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, and I love this book by the way, but the very first chapter, you're so confused, you're not really sure what is going on, and you feel just as lost and confused as our main character in this one, and then you slowly start to uncover the mystery of what is happening in a really, really fun way. This is kind of the same for that. So at the very beginning of this book, we are introduced to Carolyn. She is one of a number of librarians, and she is studying languages. She's studying all languages, and even though she is just in her 30s, it seems like when you're at the library, time kind of moves a little bit differently. Carolyn is not the only librarian. She is one of a handful of librarians that were handpicked as children by their father, and they're his children, and they exclusively live at this library. They all have a very different discipline that they study at this library, and the ways that they learn about the world about them kind of is a little bit like superpowers almost. Like Carolyn knows every single language that's ever been pretty much conceived, and she can speak them, she's fluent in them. Her brother can speak with animals and interact with them. Another brother is like really big into science and mathematics. One of her sisters knows about the dead and raising things back from the dead and what happens when we die. So they all have very different, very bizarre concentrations of study in this library. It's very engaging, and this book is doing what I think a great cult book does, is we follow, you know, a protagonist who has been in this library. Carolyn's been in this library since she was a child. So this is her everyday, this is her normal, and she just goes about her day, and we as the readers see how deeply bizarre and creepy and sinister everything is. So that's the library. There's a lot going on, but at the very beginning of this story, we realize that father has disappeared, and these children have been living under him. They've been learning from him. They have been very much under his supervision and rule, and he has rules for them and what they can and cannot do. So all of a sudden he disappears. They're worried for him. Potentially he could be missing or dead, which is crazy because, you know, it kind of seems like they think that their father is actually God. So a lot going on there. They are searching for him. There's so much going on that still at 50% of the way, there are still pieces to the puzzle where I'm like, I don't know what this is all about, but I'm sure we'll get to it later. And just the way that these librarians interact with the library and themselves, and then they have to interact with the world around them, it's just so interesting. I will say this one feels a lot more fantasy than horror. Like I would say primarily this is a fantasy with horror elements, but it does have very graphic, horrific horror elements. So I definitely can see why this was put in a horror book recommendations list, because this gets very dark. It does go there. I would say trigger warnings, especially for like animal cruelty, animal abuse. There are a lot of animals in here. There are a lot of dogs in particular, and they don't all survive. So that's not really a spoiler, but just like a content warning, this does get very graphic, very brutal. It's a very bloody book. A lot of characters, both animal and human, they're getting killed off, and the ways that they're tortured, both like at the hands of their father in this cult for just punishment for doing things wrong, and then the way that they interact with the outside world, it gets very brutal. So heads up going into that. Even though I would say this is a fantasy, it gets very dark, and I am just so intrigued. I don't know what else to say about it at this point, but I'm very invested. This is definitely a page turner, and I am having a whole lot of fun. So I am going to go finish this book up, and then I will come on, give my final thoughts about this book, and wrap this vlog up. So have now finished The Library at Mount Char, and I ended up loving this one. I actually think this could potentially make it on my list of the top 10 books of the year for me from beginning to end. I just had a great time with this story, and I was so invested in the story. Even though at the beginning I had no idea what was going on, I knew that I needed to learn more, and I loved it. I finished this book, I loved it, I wanted more by this author. So imagine my surprise when I looked up this author and realized the only other thing so this author has written is a bunch of Linux coding manuals. So this is his only book. This seems like a side quest for him, which is just so wild. A lot of the elements, like there's some math and science theory elements in here that now make more sense knowing that he has that Linux programming background, but that's just so wild. Like, this is the only thing that this author has come out with, and I absolutely ate it up. Now, I would say this is definitely a fantasy with horror elements. This does get very brutal, very bloody. A lot of things that happen are very horrific to imagine, the things that Carolyn and her siblings go through at the hands of father, and then the ways in which various characters inflict and receive pain upon each other throughout this book gets very graphic, very gruesome. So I do understand why this would appeal to horror readers. I am someone who loves fantasy and horror, and I did think this was the perfect sweet spot between the two. It also kind of feels a little bit sci-fi, a little bit cosmic at times. This book is really hard to define just because I've never really read another book like it, and that makes it really hard to explain, because part of the charm in this, at least for me, is reading a chapter and being like, I don't understand, maybe actually I think we're going in this direction, and then the next chapter takes me somewhere completely different. So I really had a lot of fun with this one. I will say thematically, this one feels like Umbrella Academy season 1, particularly the fight where I think 5 is the character's name. I haven't watched all of Umbrella Academy because it really fell off, but in the first season, 5 is fighting at a donut shop, and the musical scoring for that fight sequence is Istanbul, not Constantinople. So there's like it's very extremely bloody fight sequence, like a lot of horrific body horror things happen, but then you have the campy Istanbul, not Constantinople song playing. That kind of feels like this book in a lot of ways. Like, it does lean a little bit campy, but then it goes really dark, and just the way that everything comes together, I really loved this one. This was definitely a great way to end the vlog. I loved ending it on such a positive note, and now it's time to rank all of the books, all of the culty books that I read during this vlog. So my least favorite, that's going to come as no surprise, is Devil's Creek by Todd Kiesling. This one just didn't have any character work, and the pacing and just overall the general tone, I just really couldn't find a lot about this work that worked for me personally. That was an easy one. The rest of them I did end up pretty much enjoying for the most part. So let's just say my second least favorite was Beneath by Kristi DeMeester, just because I loved the first half of this one so much, and then the second half just went in a completely different direction. So I think for this one, you're going to want to know that it is Southern Gothic, but it also does have some cosmic elements, and for me, I cannot be surprised by cosmic elements. I need to know that that is a factor, because I am never impressed with it when it is a twist. That's just my personal preference. So we'll have Beneath next. These next two are definitely a toss-up, could just depend upon the day for me, but Little Eve by Catriona Ward goes next, just because I have read a 5-star from Catriona Ward before, and I've read this author like at her A game, and this one is not like her best book. I know she can do like a whole lot better, but this was an amazing book, don't get me wrong. Just I like can compare other things of hers to this book. I really enjoyed it though. This one definitely very gothic, very atmospheric, and I really liked the way all of the mysteries came together. Next up we have Revelator by Daryl Gregory. This one, I just feel like this was such an engaging character study. I loved the historical fiction elements. That really worked for me, and I just loved how, you know, we did have Ghost Daddy, we had those creepy paranormal elements, but we also had like the slice of life elements in this one as well. I just think that overall, even though Little Eve was more twisty and turny and you didn't see it coming, and this one I could see a lot of what was coming, I really loved the character work. This is top-notch character work and Southern Gothic, like at its very best. So I really enjoyed my reading experience with Revelator, and I do think it's going to stick with me for a very long time. And then of course my favorite book in this vlog was The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins, and I'm really hoping that, you know, he comes out with something else. I have, he searched the internet on Reddit, and he did like a Q&A on his website, and he did say that he would love to return and write another story, potentially in this world, potentially in another world in the future. So, you know, we'll hold out hope. I don't mind when authors take a lot of time between releases and get everything perfect. It just means that whenever we get, or if we ever get, a second book by this author, it'll be such a pleasant surprise. So yeah, I really loved this one, and overall I had a great time with this vlog. I was not anticipating, like when I started this Colds vlog, I didn't really anticipate it being something that would go uniformly almost so well for me, because it's not something that I don't think I gravitate towards. Like when I hear a book is about a cult, that's not necessarily an auto pickup topic for me, but I think definitely like with cults you also have maybe a little bit of religious exploration, religious trauma, those kind of themes. So I do see why a lot of these books would work so well for me. So that is the end of this vlog. I know it's a longer one. Thank you all so much for watching. If you made it to the end of this video, go ahead and leave like a cultish emoji down below. I don't know, whatever that means to you. If not, go ahead and leave a green heart, because I'm wearing kind of a greenish shirt, green or blue heart. I don't know. Teal is in the mix of those two, but whatever. Leave an emoji down below if you made it to the end. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to give it a like, subscribe to my channel for all of the bookish, cozy, gaming, and horror content. Stay safe, stay spooky, and I will see y'all in the next video. Bye!